Hi everyone, my name is Matt Walker. I'm Senior Research Manager at NFER, and I'm part of a team who's been conducting research into what I think is a critical but often overlooked issue, which is the uneven distribution of pupils with SEND across mainstream schools in England. And the findings raise issues that are relevant to the school's white paper, which I hope to briefly reflect on at the end of my presentation. Our study focused on three research questions. How are pupils with SEND currently distributed across mainstream schools? How has this changed over time? What are the factors driving this distribution? And what are the implications of this distribution on schools and pupils? So far, we've published an interim report, a sort of scene-setting report, which mainly addresses the first research question. The final report we're currently working on, it will be due out in June. So what I'd like to do today is just share some early insights into the emerging findings that will feature in that final report. So just a brief note on methods. So our study comprised 4 strands, multi-method project. The first involved analysis of national pupil database data, so that's administrative pupil level data, to better understand the characteristics of high SEND schools, and I'll go on to describe those in a moment, and the movements of pupils with SEND between schools. The second strand involved exploratory interviews with 10 senior local authority officers with responsibility for SEND, and those local authorities were selected because of the variation in proportions of pupils with SEND across their schools in their authorities. The third strand comprised school case studies, and in total we've completed just short of 100 interviews. That involved interviews with 15 high SEND schools, where we spoke with senior leaders, SENCOs, middle leaders, local authority staff, and the parents of pupils with and without SEND. And to highlight where experiences appeared distinctive to high SEND context, which was the focus of our research, we also spoke to senior leaders and SENCOs in a comparison group of 18 schools. Now, these 18 schools didn't meet our definition of being a high SEND school, but they did have differing SEND rates. So we shouldn't just consider them as being low SEND. It was a mixed picture within that group. And the final strand involved a national survey of 800 school leaders and SENCOs, and both the survey and the case studies included both primary and secondary schools. So how are pupils with SEND currently distributed across mainstream schools in England? So this slide just briefly summarises some of the key findings against our first research question. So mainstream schools are now educating a growing share of pupils with the highest levels of need. So more than half of pupils with EHCPs are now educated in mainstream schools. That's up from 49% a decade ago. And the fastest growth is in primary settings. Crucially, we also found that pupils with SEND are not evenly distributed across England's mainstream schools, and that unevenness is growing. So in 2024-25, primary schools in the highest EHCP rate quartile had around 6 times as many pupils with EHCPs as those in the lowest quartile. And we found a similar 5-fold difference in secondary schools. So in absolute terms, that equates to an average of 3 pupils per primary school in the lowest quartile compared to 17 pupils per school in the highest quartile. So I think that gives you a flavour of the differences that these schools are experiencing. And as part of the research, we've identified 2 groups of schools with higher proportions of pupils with SEND. The first includes schools with above average proportions of pupils with EHCPs, compared both with their local area and nationally, and we refer to those schools as high EHCP schools or HES schools. The second group includes schools with higher than expected proportions of pupils with EHCPs and or SEND support. We call those higher SEND schools. And there's some important similarities and distinctions between the characteristics of these schools and schools more broadly. So both groups are more likely to draw from more disadvantaged communities and have low average test scores, particularly the high SEND schools. Secondary high EHCP schools are also generally smaller in size than typical secondaries. So moving on to discuss our second research question, and which is what are the factors driving this uneven distribution? And I want to begin with an overall explanation emerging from the research. So the uneven distribution of pupils with SEND does not appear random or primarily drawn by differences in pupil need. Instead, school staff, parents and local authority officers describe what we've interpreted as a structural steering effect within the system. And this involves two forces operating simultaneously. So on the one hand, you've got a group of schools who are developing a strong reputation for inclusion and expertise, but at the same time, there are system-level capacity pressures limiting placement options elsewhere. And together, these create predictable patterns where pupils with SEND are educated. And this helps explain, I think, why uneven distribution persists despite a shared commitment to inclusion across schools. I'm just going to go on to a few slides to unpack some of those drivers in order of importance. So the strongest and most consistent theme across high SEND schools was ethos. School staff repeatedly framed inclusion as a core identity rather than as a policy requirement. Many high SEND schools reported building broad reputations, things like warmth, nurture, pastoral strength, not just SEND expertise. And conversely, some of the comparison schools were explicit that they avoided cultivating such reputations. Many staff in high SEND schools described an implicit principle that we do not turn pupils away because of need. Some of our case study schools had specialist units, and this speaks to the issues about main specialist provision within mainstream schools. And of course, hosting any type of specialist or resource provision inevitably shifts the school's intake profile. Staff in these settings described a clear pull effect, especially once the provision became well known locally. And similarly, where strong SEND-focused schools or specialist resource provision were located nearby, comparison schools reported that they experienced reduced demand from families of children with SEND. Parents, local authorities and other schools then begin to view these settings as places that can successfully support complex need. And importantly, success generates demand. So schools that build this expertise attract further placements, reinforcing their reputation. So reputation creates the pull effects towards certain schools. And the next slide goes on to talk about the push factors operating elsewhere. So alongside reputation, local authority and system pressures appear to also play a major role. So placement decisions from our interviews were described as often being made within tight constraints, which include shortages of specialist provision, limited spaces, and urgency to secure placements. And it's in this context that inclusive mainstream schools become the most viable option. And this is not necessarily strategic planning. It's frequently pragmatic decision-making under pressure. So the key message here is that capacity constraints elsewhere steer pupils towards more inclusive schools. So what are the implications for this uneven distribution for both schools and pupils? So from the qualitative interviews we conducted with staff and parents in high SEND schools, we identified a number of benefits that these settings can create, and I've listed some of those on the slide. So staff and parents described a school culture where difference is expected and accepted. Parents of non-SEND pupils noted that their children develop empathy and awareness through daily exposure to diverse needs. Additionally, structures like high staff to pupil ratios, sensory strategies, and flexible classroom routines were reported to benefit a wide range of learners, not just those with SEND. Parents repeatedly mentioned that their children, both SEND and non-SEND, experience schools as more relational and supportive because inclusivity is embedded throughout. High SEND contexts were described as professionally enriching for staff. SENCOs highlighted deepened expertise from regular problem solving and from targeted training. In terms of pupil outcomes, interviewees framed these in broad terms. So emotional regulation, confidence, independence and social belonging were seen as central outcomes. And in terms of benefits for non-SEND pupils, the parents of non-SEND pupils reported a number of what they perceived as unexpected advantages. Many attributed their children's empathy and openness to daily interactions with a diverse group of people. They also highlighted that flexible teaching approaches, movement breaks and high adult availability supported their children's learning and well-being, even when they had no identified form of SEND. And the impacts on families were also reported to be great. So parents described, in some cases, transformative experiences when schools provided responsive, stable support. Several reported significant improvements in their children's behaviour, confidence and engagement. And families emphasised how strong relationships and reliable support reduced emotional strain, with some describing life-changing impacts. So our survey also shed some light on what we can learn from the inclusion-based policies in the white paper, and whether they can provide part of a meaningful solution to the SEND crisis. So we asked schools responding to the survey whether they had a SEND unit or resource provision, and then asked those that did some follow-up questions. And the findings make for mixed reading. I pulled out some of the findings here on this slide. So just to say, around half of our surveyed schools reported having some kind of inclusion base. So we're talking about SEND units or RP here, but only around a quarter of those had a base that was identified within DFE data. So this was quite interesting, that more schools reported having a base than is formally recognised within DFE. And we had anecdotal evidence from our conversations with schools that schools were creating their own bases, but albeit without local authority funding. So this slide shows results for primary schools, but the results for secondaries were similar. So just to pick out a few of these findings, you can see them. So of the schools that reported having a SEND unit or resource provision in our survey, 62% agreed that this provision enhanced their overall capacity and expertise to support a wide range of SEND. And that figure increased to 82% for those with bases as identified within DFE data. So I think that is a positive message emerging, but there are also some points in here that are more challenging. Only around a quarter of school pupils were reported to have limited interactions or friendships with peers outside of their provision, which may reflect the nature of the specialist base that they were offering, but I think is concerning. Only 2/3 of primary schools felt pupils attending the base were well integrated into mainstream lessons and activities, and about 1/3 of schools reported weak joint working between base staff and mainstream teachers, potentially limiting the development of shared expertise and coherent support. So I think the key message from our research here is that inclusion bases are not a silver bullet. True inclusion depends on a whole school approach and an ethos. It's not just about having a dedicated space or room in your school. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about challenges. As you can imagine, high SEND schools and indeed the comparison schools spoke about at length around a range of challenges. And I pulled out some of the key ones here. So I start in the top right hand corner here, staffing and workload. Staff repeatedly described the intensity of working in high SEND environments. So constant problem solving, managing unpredictable situations and balancing high needs pupils with the wider cohort. In terms of challenges for pupils, schools highlighted that maintaining equitable experience for all pupils required constant monitoring. Some pupils received what were reported to receive less one-to-one attention than was thought to be ideal, and parents of non-SEND pupils described instances where some pupils, but particularly able pupils, were not being sufficiently challenged, or they talked about increased disruption in the classroom, which I think shows the tension between inclusive practice and the perceived impacts on the wider cohort of pupils. In terms of research shortfalls, I mean, this came up consistently, as sort of testified to Luke's presentation a minute ago. Schools described funding gaps, especially where resource provision costs exceeded allocated budgets. And this was a general running theme that even though additional funding is being supplied through EHCPs, many schools perceived that each of those came with their own deficit. So you ended up with this amplifying effect with schools with high concentrations of pupils with EHCPs. In terms of system level limitations, staff widely described the SEND system as being broken, long waits for assessments, delayed diagnosis and support. Thresholds were reported to vary across areas, creating inequity and uncertainty. Many schools who might benefit from specialist settings, many pupils, who might benefit from specialist settings were reported to remain in mainstream schools due to limited specialist places being available. And parents also reported mismatched processes between health and education, as well as variable EHCP quality. Where there were high concentrations of SEMH needs or trauma histories in schools, staff reported behavioural and safeguarding pressures that often escalated. Staff described the emotional intensity of responding to what they described as crisis-driven situations, and the work involved with coordinating with external agencies and monitoring vulnerable people's well-being. Schools noted that accountability frameworks don't always account for the complexity of high SEND contexts. Standard outcomes-based measures can create unfair pressure or risk of negative inspection outcomes despite strong inclusive practice. And parents of pupils with SEND describe profound and ongoing strain. So many stress the emotional toll of long processes, repeated assessments, and the ongoing battle for recognition or support. Accounts emphasise that even when schools were supportive, the wider system placed significant demands on families, shaping their overall experience. And I should say we saw, it was reported to us, similar challenges were experienced in the comparison schools as well, but there does seem to be an amplification effect where you have this concentration of pupils with SEND in these schools. So just to sum up the findings across those three research questions, we've seen that pupils with SEND are unevenly distributed across England's mainstream schools. Capacity and sufficiency pressures are steering placements towards more inclusive schools, raising EHCP and SEND proportions in some settings. And the implications of this are that it's putting increasing pressure on schools, affecting capacity and pupil experience. And so high SEND schools are building strong inclusive practice. We certainly came across some self-reported examples of good practice, and parents were nearly universal praise for the support their children were getting in these settings. But at the same time, they're facing what many described as unsustainable strain and pressure. So, final slide. What does this all mean in relation to the school's white paper? And I think it's a mixed picture potentially. So I think the reforms have the potential to address some of the challenges and problems that I've just outlined. So levelling up early intervention so families don't feel that they need an EHCP in order to access the support they need for their children. The aspiration of raising inclusion expectations for all schools, therefore potentially reducing reputational clustering. But also the reforms, I think, will also create additional pressure, particularly for high SEND schools. So there are significant workload implications of some of the policies that are coming in, particularly the creation of new ISPs and the requirement for EHCPs to be reviewed at transition points could speak to additional burdens coming particularly to secondary schools with existing high EHCP cohorts. And limitations in SENCO capacity, I think, present a critical risk to the effective implementation of these reforms. And I'll stop there.